Well, hey everybody, Mr. Reeves back with you, and today we're going to be looking at circumference of a circle. All right, but before we dive into what circumference is and how to calculate it, let's do some review of some vocabulary surrounding circles. All right, so right here you could see we have a circle. All right, and a circle is a set of points in a plane that are a fixed distance from the center. So right here I have my center point. All right, there's my center point. And I'm going to take what we call a compass here. All right, and I'm going to place the point of the compass on the center, and then I'm going to go out here this far. All right, that is the distance of our radius, and the radius is the segment that goes from the center to any point on the circle. All right, and that distance there is that fixed distance that we're talking about. That is the fixed distance of our circle, and watch as I go around, it forms that circle. Okay, so a circle is simply a set of points that are the same distance away from a given point, which is our center. All right, now they have a vocabulary word that they left off that I would like to add, and I'm going to add one more segment on here that they don't have. All right, and this point is going to be called a chord. All right, so I'm going to go ahead here and label that, and this is going to be C-H-O-R-D. That is a chord. A chord on a circle is any segment that goes from one point on a circle to another point on the circle. Okay, so that's a chord. Okay, another chord I could make could be like from, whoops, I missed the end. It really should go exactly from on the circle to another point on the circle. That's a chord. All right, I could do another chord like that. That's a chord. So a chord is any segment that has its endpoints on the circle. Okay? So again, a radius is a segment, but the radius goes from the center to a point on the circle. All right, if you take a chord that goes through the center, so this is a chord right here, but it goes through the center, then that is called a diameter. All right, this would be another diameter right there. All right, I could do another diameter right there. A diameter is any chord that goes through the center. Got it? Okay, now it so happens that a diameter is twice the length of a radius, because if you think about it, right, if I go back here, this would be a radius here, right? And this would be a radius here, and you put those two together and you get the diameter. Okay, so there is our basic vocabulary. Before we get to circumference, we have the definition of a circle, which is a set of points that are the same distance away from a given point called the center. All right. We have a radius, which goes from the center to any point on the circle. That's a line segment. You have a chord, which is any segment that has its endpoints on the circle. Pick any point on the circle, go through the circle to another point on the circle. That's a chord. And a very special chord is called the diameter. It's a chord that goes through the center. The diameter is twice the length of the radius. All right, and now finally to what we've been waiting for, circumference right here, circumference. Circumference is the distance around the circle. So if I pick any point on the circle, all right, and I go around, all the way around the circle and back to where I started, that is called the circumference. All right, and it doesn't matter where you start, that distance around will always be the same. All right, and that's what we're going to be working with in this lesson, the circumference of a circle. So the question you might have is, how do you find the circumference? Well, I'm so glad you asked. All right. Now, before we talk about circumference, there's actually one more thing we need to talk about, and that is this funny number called pi, all right? It's actually a Greek symbol, pi. It's actually a letter in their alphabet, all right? Pi is approximated by using the number 3.14 or 22 over 7. But pi is exactly, there's actually a formula. And if you take the circumference of a circle, which we just said was the distance all the way around, and you divide it by the diameter, you get pi. Now, pi is an irrational number. If you remember from earlier in the year, irrational numbers are numbers that go on forever and ever and ever. They don't terminate and they don't repeat. All right, so pi goes on forever and ever and ever, which means there's no way for you actually to put at the exact value of pi in your calculator or to do a problem and get an exact answer unless you just put pi. So we often approximate pi, all right? We often approximate pi by using 3.14 or 22 over 7. Let me pull up my calculator and let's just compare these. So we often just use 3.14 for pi. All right, if I were to do 22 divided by 7, you can see what we get. We get this number here, 3.1428. If I use the pi button on my calculator, that's going to give me the most accurate value. All right, and you could see when we compare that 22 over 7 is actually a little bit too big. It's bigger. See how this is a 1 and that's a 2. All right, so when you are doing problems with circumference, and later on we're going to do problems with area, you need to pay close attention to the instructions. Do they tell you to use the pi button on your calculator, or do they tell you to approximate using 3.14 or 22 over 7? You might wonder, why does it matter? Because when you go to round your answer, it will make a difference. Okay, if you use 22 over 7, your answer is going to be bigger. If you use 3.14, your answer is going to be smaller. And if you use the pi button, it's going to be in between those two. All right, so pay close attention when you're doing the problems to how they ask you to represent pi. So what is the formula for circumference? Here it is right here. The formula for circumference says take that number pi that we were just talking about and multiply it by the diameter. Okay, so pi times d, or we can say d times pi. All right, so circumference is pi times diameter or diameter times pi. It's the same value. It's just this one puts the diameter second. This one puts the diameter first. I actually like the second one better because if you're giving the exact value, like if the diameter were 10, you could just say that the circumference is 10 pi. We wouldn't say pi times 10. Okay? Sometimes, however, they're not going to give you the diameter. Instead, they're going to give you the radius. And you should recall, remember what we said? That the diameter is equal to 2 times the radius. Again, if we go back here to our picture, just to remind you again, that green segment is the diameter, all right? But if I go from the center that way, that's the radius. And if I go from the center that way, that's the radius. So 2r is equal to d. This is important. 2r is equal to d. Okay, so if instead of being given the diameter, you're given the radius, then we can say, and I need to go down a little further here so we can actually see it, all right, that you can actually use this instead. Instead of the diameter being pi times d, we can say it's 2 times pi times the radius. Remember, what we have is pi times d, which would be pi times 2r, but then we normally move that 2 to the front, and we say 2 times pi times r. All right, so two different ways to find the circumference: the diameter times pi, or twice the radius times pi. So here's an example they have in the book. All right, they've got a circle with a radius of 14. Now remember, this is a radius because it goes halfway. Right here down below it, this is a diameter because it goes all the way across. So when you're doing these problems, pay close attention. Are they giving you the radius, or are they giving you the diameter? Are they giving the segment that goes halfway, or are they giving the segment that goes all the way across? If they give you the segment that goes halfway, then you're going to use this formula right here. Circumference is equal to 2 times pi times r. Now notice they said to use 22 over 7 for pi. So r is equal to 14. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up my calculator and clear this off. So let's do it all 3 ways. Okay, so the way they did it is 2 times, all right, 22 over 7. So I'm putting it in parentheses, all right, and then times 14, all right. 2 times pi times r, but they use 22 over 7, and we get about 88. Now, if I do 2 times 3.14 times 14, all right, so now I'm using 3.14, which is another way to approximate pi. You see we get 87.92, which is a little bit smaller. And finally, if I do 2 times the pi button on my calculator times 14, you see I get 87.96. So using 3.14 gives me the smallest value. All right, using the pi button gives me a bigger value, and because 22 over 7 is actually a little bit bigger than pi, it actually gives me the biggest value. Notice they're all pretty close together, but that's why I'm telling you it makes a difference. Look at the directions and follow what the directions say. So again, given the radius, there's your formula. Okay? But what about if they give you the diameter? All right, now it says find the circumference of the circle to the nearest hundredth. And then just after I told you to pay close attention to what value to use for pi, they didn't tell us. Okay, so but let's go here and remember, since we're given the diameter, the formula for circumference is diameter times pi. All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to clear all this out. Let's do it all 3 ways, okay? So the diameter is 11, so I could do 11 times, and if we use the fraction value, it would be 22 divided by 7, all right? And we get that value, 34.57, and so on. So that's if we use 22 over 7. What if we use 3.14 for pi? Well, then we get a number that is smaller, 34.54. And finally, my favorite is just to use the pi button on the calculator, because I think that, well, I don't think, I know that's the most accurate we can get. And we get this value, 34.557, and so on. So all of those would be acceptable answers for this problem, all right, because they didn't tell us. Now, they said to round to the nearest hundredth. And here's where we get into problems, because rounded to the nearest hundredth is going to give us different values depending on which one we do here. So if we look at this first one, remember, the first place is tenths, the second place is hundredths. So if I rounded this first one to the nearest hundredth, I would go, okay, there's 2 places. I go to the right here. What's that number to the right of the hundredths place? It's a 1. So using 22 over 7, the answer would be 34.57. Using 3.14, it's easy because it only went 2 places. So the answer using 3.14 would be 34.54. Now, using the pi button, here we go, 34.55. When I go to the third place, because remember, we're going to rounding to the hundredths means go to the second place, but I go to the third place, and if it's 5 or bigger, I'm going to round up. Well, 7 is 5 or bigger, so it would be 34.56. All right, so depending on what value for pi I used, it could be 34.54, 34.56, or 34.57. So since they didn't tell you which one to use, if this were you giving me the answer, I would have to accept all 3 of those. By the way, rounding to the nearest hundredth is 2 places. Sometimes they might say round to the nearest tenth. All right, if you're rounding to the nearest tenth, you go 1 place, and then you go to the number to the right. So this one to the nearest tenth would be 34.6, because 7 again is 5 or bigger. This one to the nearest tenth would be 34.5 because when I went to look, here's my tenths place, one more over. That number is not 5 or bigger. So this would round to 34.6. This would round to 34.5. This one would also round to 34.6 because when I go to the place after the tenths value, it is 5 or bigger, and I would round up. All right, so when you're asked to round, hundredths means go 2 places. All right, tenths means go 1 place. And again, it really does matter what value that you use for pi. All right. So as we're looking, you can see on these ones it says use 3.14 or 22/7 for pi. All right, this one says use 3.14 for pi. And again, pay attention to what it says to round. This says round to the nearest hundredth if necessary. All right, I'll be making a video. My next video, I'll go through and work through a lot of these examples. So if you want to see these examples done and what it looks like when you round, watch that next video coming up. All right, but this has been an introduction to circumference, including a lot of important vocabulary about a circle and its parts. All right, until next time, have a great day. See ya.